uncharted territory, where roadmaps are useless, conditions don't negotiate, the terrain doesn't wait, where opportunity abounds, but so does death. The builders who understand what's coming aren't mapping it, they're already climbing. This is Incline.
Rene, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you. We're excited to dive in. I know you've got a few cool things going on. Too many. I'm overwhelmed. I'm looking at your LinkedIn and I'm just like, where do I even start?
Yeah, maybe you could help us figure it all out here. Let's unpack it a little.
Let's dive in. Yeah.
Do you here's my first question. Do you want to talk more? You got Celo and Self. I feel like we could go down either of those routes. Maybe feel free to open up with an intro and kind of help us position how you're thinking about the relationship difference, where you're spending your time. We've loved seeing all the different things being built on Celo, but we'll let you take it.
No, it's cool. You've had some Celo friends on the show before, so yeah, it's awesome. Look, Self came out of Celo, right? We and you guys will remember this and appreciate it. The first sort of agents that been dabbling with were crypto agents, right? And then now it's sort of this mainstream thing. But I think there was this insight maybe 2 years ago that we'll move into this world where a lot of the, not just on-chain, but sort of internet traffic and activity is going to be agentic, right? And identity is going to matter even more than ever. And so that got us sort of down this road. And we'd always thought about identity in the context of, obviously stablecoin commerce with Celo and trying to figure out what's the right solution. But it was very clear that there was a need for a much more holistic platform. And so a starting point for Self in the early days was a lot around just, civil resistance, right? As people were kind of, for example, distributing rewards on the major platforms. So Uniswap, they all integrated Self early on for that sort of proof of human. But now that's really a lot of the use cases now are in sort of the agentic web space and around sovereign AI. I'm happy to talk about that. I'll give you guys a little sort of sneak preview, exclusive preview here, some alpha on the show. So
we love it.
Yeah, right. You probably saw that USAT went live on Celo, which is very exciting. And we did previously had sort of an announcement, but there was more sort of high level. And so I'll get more into this, that will also have a partnership with Google. So Google, USAT, Self, everything is running on Celo, basically giving people free stablecoins, right? And so all they have to do is verify that they're a unique human with Self, and then put their wallet, and boom, they have money in it, right? And so that's really the first of its kind implementation. It's global, right? All you need is to verify your passport or ID through Self. You don't even need a Google account, I think. And there you go. And that's really kind of a phenomenal step. When we started Celo, we're maybe a little backstory there. We were very excited by Ethereum, and sort of it looked like, well, money can be software now, right? And can have all these features. And so spend a lot of time thinking about what are the features of money you would want. And there was always sort of from the very early Celo days, and even in our early ecosystem, a lot of people excited about things like universal basic income, right? Fast forward to today, it's not just people getting people money, right, in sort of an AI world, but it's how do we give people compute? And so this concept of universal compute is almost eclipsing in terms of the excitement, right? Sort of universal basic income, because everybody's realizing if you have access to compute, you can do things, you can build things, right? You can be productive, and you can create economic value. And so I think it's phenomenal that Google is piloting this with stablecoins, but I see a world where very soon you'll have pretty major programs where people get sort of their kind of daily allocation of compute. And that to me is a super exciting use case for this tech.
Yeah, absolutely. So these use cases here, it looks like you're really driving is you have a couple of these on the site. Maybe we can kind of use these as one. I like how you've framed some of these and just kind of helping people get to step 2 or 3 in their minds of like, why would this be useful? Like, how would this take shape? So you have pre-K age verification, proof of human. So it's like, I'm not an agent, I'm actually a human. And then things around sovereign citizenship, personhood. Why these core buckets? And maybe speak to like some of the issues given your work with Celo and some of the things that we've run into in the past with crypto and all these things. Like, why are these types of problems, like, why do they exist and why do they matter in your mind?
Yeah, 100%. So we have, so Self is a protocol and you can use it for whatever use case. But what we realized is, especially now with most of our users being enterprises, right, that are a little bit removed from sort of, the protocol world, right? We've realized that actually taking Self and creating, and these are all workspaces in our Self enterprise dashboard, right? So when you come in, you can still create your custom workspace and create whatever combination of proofs you may want for whatever use case you're dreaming about. But we've realized this, it actually makes sense and helps people to give them these dedicated workspaces that are somewhat pre-configured. And so if you're a big social media player and you're looking to just put an age verification check in your sign up flow, for example, right? You just take the age verification workspace and it takes 5 minutes to set it up. If you're doing some distribution, right, and where you're giving out rewards and you want to do a proof of human check, boom, you just go in and that's pre-configured. You just have to maybe change 1 or 2 dials depending on like what exactly you're looking for. Same with sovereign, right? Like after Fable 5 and expert controls kind of happen, right? Everybody's like, oh my God, I may not have access to my favorite models in the future. So what does it mean, right? How do we think about sort of a more sovereign setup, right? Where we are, where we have more control power over the systems that we're using. And so that for us has been a lot of it's been customer driven. People are like, hey, I want to do this thing. And then you have a few people say the same thing. You're like, okay, let's create a custom workspace to make it just super easy for people to onboard. And, I think with all the excitement about AI and agents, I've used agents in a personal context and we're using agents, obviously building Self and at Celo as well. But in a lot of traditional companies, right, they're only starting now, right? They're thinking about, okay, we have these workflows. How do we set up, how do we make this workflow agentic, right? And what we realize is that as people are kind of engaging in this exercise, there's the point of friction is whenever identity is involved. Identity in the narrow sense of like verifying, whether you're human or who is sort of the person behind an agent. We have a product for that called Agent ID, but also more critically in the broader sense of identity, right? Who has access to the credentials, right, to a certain service, or who can control, payment details, and so all of that is where we're sort of using kind of the same sort of Self technology that's based on zero knowledge proofs and TEs to offer a much wider range of functionality to help people securely, privately, onboard to this new agentic world. And that's in many ways much bigger scope than we would have ever imagined for this product. But it's exciting. I feel like you guys will appreciate this. Stablecoins, of course, killer use case for crypto, right? I do think sort of security, privacy, and using cryptographic systems in AI is sort of the other big killer use case that hopefully also create a much better sort of perception for crypto as an industry in the broader world, because it is sort of the one thing that can really help keep the stuff, keep agents in control and, not have them, abuse all the data that they're getting from us, right? So I think this is where we're excited to see, this technology be just super useful.
Absolutely.
I loved something you said earlier, Rene, about sort of designing money, like how this should be. It seems like you guys aren't just taking on a challenge where you say, oh, this problem already exists and we're just fixing it. You're kind of designing the future, giving people what they don't even know that they want yet, because it's sort of you're having to imagine a future that, while people can say directionally, I know this is coming, but do you find yourself trying to imagine, oh, how should this work? How should agentic finance work? How should we be able, like, it seems like you might almost have to project yourself into the future.
Yeah. I mean, this is the fun working in these sort of frontier industries, right? You sometimes, I mean, a lot of it is like there's no chartered territory. I mean, kind of the trailer you guys played before, right? It's like spot on, right? You don't really know what this is going to look like, and so you have to, make a couple educated guesses, run a bunch of tests, do a lot of experiments, and be ready for them to fail, right? And I think specifically with Celo, I think back to the early days, and I mean, one fun example is from almost the very first days. This is like 2018, we're thinking a lot about on-chain FX, right? And we're thinking about, okay, well, if you look at, and I had worked at Morgan Stanley beginning of my career doing, interest rate and FX derivatives. And so I was very passionate about like, moving sort of FX markets on chain and having like 24/7 trading and like going more seamlessly between different currencies and maybe allowing like smaller companies to more easily hedge exposure. And, it was like 2018, you barely had like, I mean, Tether was live, right? But there wasn't like, not even like,
it feels like we're just now getting to that moment with FX on chain. It feels like it's just now happening in the last 6 months. Yeah.
And so it's like, I look back to my notes from back then and conversations and, it's like, wow, like, this is like a probably like a whole like 10 years too early, because even now we're still, I mean, Celo, you guys have probably seen in the last week or so, we onboarded like 7 or 8 new non-dollar stables. So the Ripio stables, which, cover Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, I'm looking up here, Colombia, Chile, Peru. So all these stable coins. And then this morning, super exciting, fiat-backed Nigerian CNGN that also went live. And, now you actually have spot markets, right? You still don't have like, sort of yield curves and future markets to do some of the more advanced derivative stuff that, I think will happen. But at least now, this stuff is happening and you can actually do more interesting things. I think what Textile is doing, particularly in Nigeria, where, they're already working with like, I think it's like close to 80 OTC and cross-border payment companies on like hedging, right? In sort of Naira to dollars. That's super fascinating. And, I feel like we're talking about this stuff back in 2018 and it's really starting to happen now. And so sometimes you just have to be comfortable with an idea taking, close to 10 years to come to fruition. But it's exciting. And for Celo, we've always been focused on that. And so it's particularly cool to see it now really, really happen at this kind of big scale. And I think this is where, with this partnership with Google and Tether now, it's also a testament to the team just, through the bear market, through all the ups and downs, just executing, right? We're now, I think for Tether, we're driving 27% or so of their kind of global transaction count, right? So, across all chains, all ecosystems, let me make sure I get the number right. 28% of USDT transfers happen on Celo, right? Which is massive. And I think we're the biggest with 90% market share in terms of number of holders for their Tether Gold product, right? So it's just like, these things don't happen overnight, and they're sort of a function of working with big partners in market, like, through Opera with MiniPay and others to really build up an ecosystem and distribution and you, quite frankly, use cases that anchor stablecoin usage in real world, in the real world, right? Not just for sort of hodling and getting some yield, but actually payments and commerce. So in some ways, a lot of this ends up tying together, right? Because you do need identity, you do need sort of the agentic infrastructure, because a lot of the future sort of volume, right, in terms of on-chain transactions, even in FX, will likely just be driven by agents. And so it's a little bit like, putting the different pieces in place and making sure you have whatever it takes to validate a certain use case and then grow it from there.
So given Celo's network and just like volume, like you said it was 28% or 26% of Tether's total volume is on, or USDT transfers are on Celo. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I looked it up just now. 28% of USDT transfers across all blockchains are on Celo. So it's not the dollar volume amount, because that, obviously also, depends a little bit on, what chains the exchanges work with. But if you look at sort of individual holders, wallets, right, transacting in USDT, and look at sort of all the transfers that are happening, it's like 28% market share, which is super exciting. And, we're definitely in our sort of, as we look at success, what success looks like, right? It looks at like real people transacting in stablecoins, right? Whether, and this obviously, is kind of also where self comes in, because we know, for example, behind every Opera MiniPay user, there's a real human, right? Because we've gone through like a self verification, either lightweight or sort of the full NFC one.
I wanted to ask
a little bit to Opera. Sorry, Zach, my bad.
You're good.
Speak a little bit to, like, Opera has been such a interesting company to follow. Like, Charles was one of our first ever podcast interviews, like back in 2024. And I know that Opera and MiniPay has had such a embedded relationship and meaningful relationship to the Celo blockchain. Speak a little bit about the work with Charles and team, and then also like, putting a bow on how a relationship like that really positions Self. Because from what I'm gathering, just knowing your role at Celo, the really interesting like vantage point you have with what you've mentioned with Tether and the ecosystem that Celo provides and distribution it gives, like, it seems like a really interesting example from like a baked in distribution point of view for Self to have all of these kind of perfect customers kind of ready to go. Speak a little bit to the relationship with Opera as like a leading indicator.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're totally right. And, we, when we launched Celo back in, gearing up for launch 2019, 2020, we went out and talked to a lot of people about building on Celo and doing stuff. And Opera was a part of the sort of initial cohort of sort of bigger corporations that were interested in exploring use cases, right? And so the relationship goes back, I think, sort of maybe officially we signed something back in 2021 or so. But it's, it's a good 5 years of like working together. And there are a lot of other companies who came to us along the way and were like, hey, we want to do stuff, right? And I think what I will say to Opera's credit, from the beginning, they're very focused on solving their users' problems, right? It's like, okay, well, we don't just want to kind of launch a wallet. We want to make sure this wallet makes, like helps our users, make payments or get remittances coming in, right? And it started with like some very clear value propositions, and over time, based on what users were doing, right, adding other features. And I think especially in crypto, right, you oftentimes, you have a hot narrative, right? It's like NFTs or meme coins, right? And people jump on it, but it's not clear there's real product market fit from a sort of, average user perspective, right? Everybody's just like trying it out, playing with it, right? And to Opera's credit, throughout all these ups and downs, they didn't get distracted, right? They just focused on what's probably become the best stablecoin wallet out there in the world. And so, and we've worked closely with them. We have across the team, several working sessions a week for, the last few years. And obviously they're now one of the biggest holders of Celo. So there's, beyond sort of MiniPay, there's a lot of things we're doing with the company, and they're doing with Celo. And even just, I don't know if you guys know this, but if you're using Opera, if you're like a loyal Opera user, you're actually getting rewards in Celo, right? And you can use those then to, buy digital goods, for example, change your browser background, stuff like that. So there's a real economy that's been sort of formed around the products they've been building with us. So I think that's super exciting. I think, you had Charles on. Their team also is crypto native. They get it, right? They didn't source out building this product. They build it in house, which I think is really just a testament for how forward thinking they are. So they're kind of the perfect partner. We've tried replicating this with others, and the truth is, it's hard to find a company that's like going to be dedicated and for multiple years, right? It still feels like we're early sort of innings of sort of where this can go, given their scale of 500 million plus active users, right? We're still early. But obviously it's attracted a lot more partners coming to the ecosystem now. And I do feel like, despite sort of the maybe public sentiment around crypto, there is a bit of a second, sort of momentum spring now of big corporations looking at this technology and saying, oh, this is actually like battle tested now, and what can we do? And so I almost feel like, just looking at our sort of pipeline on the Celo side and the partners that we're talking to, there's going to be some surprises here, right? As you'll see sort of even sort of big traditional companies embrace this much more than they ever have in these last 10 years of people trying to onboard companies to crypto. And stablecoins are sort of the killer use case for that, right? I think tokens are just a bit more complicated, right? And I think it's just not even getting into the regulatory side of it, right? It's this is a much more straightforward use case.
One of the last things I wanted to ask you about while we have you on, Rene, is you commented on the World Bank being right about the AI lifeline. You wrote something about not turning into a leash. I thought that was a pretty interesting perspective, particularly for regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, other developing regions, the real AI opportunity. Maybe Drew will pull this up. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about this, because this was a pretty interesting thing to read through a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, this goes back to, I think, probably one of the biggest shifts that we see right now in AI, right? Where, obviously everybody very happily, very quickly onboarded, and, it's like using Claude and like, using ChatGPT, right? And I think it's working great for a lot of people, for a lot of use cases, even in enterprises, right? But people are wondering, well, wait a second, this is like happening in big companies. This is happening at the sovereign, at the government level, right? Well, what happens with our data, right? What happens maybe even if access to one of the models we're using gets turned off again? And so this aspect of sovereignty, of owning your data, of being in control of your data, of controlling what of your data actually gets fed into an LLM. I think these are the questions that are going to drive sort of the next phase of sort of AI adoption. And I think this is where Self plays such a critical role, right? Because we have both the tools around kind of, in a way, like restricting what you kind of provide to a system, right? So for example, I give you an example. If you don't want your chatbots to know everything about you, right? But you want to prove to your chatbot that you're over 18, right? Sharing a zero knowledge proof that you're over 18 that's based on an ID is really powerful, instead of uploading a picture of your ID where suddenly all that content on the ID sits in the context, right? And that's a very simple example, right? And it's like one everybody understands, but you can expand that conceptually to all, data of an organization, right? And I think this is where I think a lot of organizations have been very, late in a way to adopting things like agents or AI more broadly, right? Because they don't want their data to leave their premises, right? And sort of be fed into these systems. And I think we're seeing this as like, I think there's a lot of tooling that is yet to be built. We're trying to build some of it with Self. But I think this is the next big wave, right? Because clearly the models itself have gotten so good that they can solve much harder problems. And now that the missing piece is really what data are you feeding them to actually get even more value out of them. And so that's really where I see Self fit. And more broadly, right, where I think cryptography and sort of the systems, the technologies we as an industry have developed in the last 10 years or so will become really valuable. And so I think early days of AI, when people were like, oh, there isn't too much overlap between crypto and AI. And, people are wondering about this, right? What is the overlap? And then you had some projects that maybe were trying to force that overlap, and you had these pitches of like AI plus crypto, and it didn't really make sense. Now it's like, no, actually, this makes sense, right? This is AI, and crypto kind of brings sort of the guardrails, the control system. And so I think it's very positive for crypto as an industry to lean into that. This, so much of sort of future growth will come from AI, and crypto can be such a useful piece of infrastructure around it. So that's a little bit where that post goes. And we're, the amount of conversations I have on a daily, weekly basis with people in government, like people at big companies, that's top of mind right now for everyone. It's like, what is happening? How should we think about how our data shows up in these systems? What are the risks? How do we control, who has access to what? How do we know, like all these agents kind of popping up, who's controlling them? What access rights do they have? I think these are sort of the big questions of our time. And I think there's plenty of space for founders, for entrepreneurs to come in and start really interesting companies at that intersection.
I love it, including yourself. Sounds like you guys are one to watch. We'll be keeping our eye on you. This was an awesome deep dive. Thank you, Rene, for taking us on it, helping us with the Celo self intersection, and also the intersection of AI and modern money, which we're really excited to keep digging into.
That's right. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thanks. Good to meet you.